Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching The City by Historia Civilis. Now, I've really got no idea what this video is about. The title and the thumbnail don't really give much away. Are we going to be talking about one particular city? London, New York, perhaps Rome? Or maybe the idea of cities generally? I really couldn't tell you. Historia Civilis has gotten a bit more abstract over the years, and usually a video like this that I really don't know much about, I probably wouldn't react to, but Historia Civilis is an exception. I've been consistently watching his videos for years now. I think Historia Civilis has made some of the best history videos on YouTube, so I'm always interested to see what they have to show. So we're going to go into this one. As always, I'll be sharing my thoughts and feelings about whatever we see today, and I'm always excited to see what Historia Civilis has to offer. So if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and if you check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. With all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction. Never before in recorded history had such vast masses of people lived in such savagely deteriorated environment, ugly in form, debased in content. Nature and purpose of the city had been completely forgotten. Oh my. Okay, getting a sense of this. The city.
Once upon a time, I almost called this YouTube channel some variation of Urbis Historia. That was for a reason. The history of the city and the history of human civilization are spiritually and definitionally linked. As cities change, everything about human society must change with them. This makes cities the apex of human achievement.
When we talk about early human history, we see the development of a civilization really goes hand in hand with the development of larger scale settlements, or what we might call cities, right? Cities bring with them a whole host of new needs and requirements and new jobs and different ways of interacting. So yeah, cities are definitely integral to studying much of human history. Of course, there have been plenty of nomadic societies throughout human history, and societies that you wouldn't really describe as urban in any sense of the word, but cities have definitely been very important.
Are the greatest things that humans ever invented. And
Wow.
Because of this,
What about the wheel? I quite like the wheel.
They are the greatest things that humans ever invented. And because of this, the consequences of the mismanagement of cities can be catastrophic.
Oh.
But before the invention of cities, the apex of human achievement was the village. Beginning in the Neolithic period, or the Late Stone Age, humans began to shift away from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle, and towards a lifestyle centered around seasonal and then permanent villages that were fixed geographically.
Yeah, this is true, though once again, we do always want to be careful with generalization, right? Remember, I know that most of human society today is sedentary human society, but there are still civilization societies today that are more nomadic in nature. So yeah, you can speak generally, but remember, we're not talking about everybody. But yes, he's talking about the sort of general change of most human civilization over time. So fair enough.
Fixed is really the key word here. Archaeologists have determined that once these villages reached a sustainable size, they stopped growing and could persist, unchanging, for potentially thousands of years. In practice, these unchanging villages settled at no fewer than 12 families and no more than 60. This remarkable stability meant that Neolithic villages had millennia to mature, and as they matured, they generally settled on the same design. Even more remarkable is the fact that the physical design of Neolithic villages tended to naturally produce the same type of government. a council of elders, which ruled by consensus. Villages were just like that for thousands of years. But then, in the late Neolithic period, a series of major technological breakthroughs suddenly increased crop yields tenfold. Now, for the first time ever, these tiny, sustainable villages were flooded with massive food surpluses. The generations living through this transformational era quite suddenly became the wealthiest people who had ever lived.
Hey, well, what does it take to get bigger cities and more developed civilization? It's gonna take a lot of food surplus, right? You need enough food to go around so that people can do other jobs besides farming, what we might call specialization.
But the wealth created an entirely new and unforeseen class of problems. The food surplus caused an immediate population boom, and before you knew it, the first cities were born. The archaeological record for these first cities tells us something really counterintuitive. Despite the tenfold increase in food production, the people who lived in these new cities actually had a worse diet than the people who lived in the old Neolithic villages. More food, but a worse diet. Huh? There are two reasons for this. First, the explosion in food production was largely limited to 3 to 5 crops, so there was more food to go around. But the food that most people got to eat was basically bread and porridge. It wasn't nutritious at all. Second, to the extent that there was nutritious food, it went to a growing class of non-agricultural workers.
Yeah, this is what I was thinking. Just because more food is being produced doesn't mean that the food is being distributed evenly, right? Doesn't mean everybody is all getting sort of good, varied diet that you might need to stay healthy. And, through a lot of human history, depending on where you look, if we look at, say, European civilization throughout a long stretch of time, people were eating a lot of wheat, a lot of bread, right? For example, when you look at the exploration of the Americas, when a lot of these European settlers arrived, they wanted to bring their their wheat-heavy diet over with them, and they often did. But a lot of the indigenous people on the eastern coast of North America were living, in comparison, with actually a healthier diet, with the three sister crops, as we often call them, which is squash, maize, aka corn, and beans. Right? Those three grew well together and actually create quite a good diet for an individual versus eating bread all of the time, right? So it does depend on the society, the civilization, how food is distributed, the conditions, the environment, what food you're actually growing.
As the population boom continued, we find archaeological evidence of all sorts of new diseases popping up in the cities. A combination of worse nutritional standards and a rush of new diseases meant that when humans moved from the villages to the cities, life expectancy fell by about 5 years.
Wow.
People had never been richer, but an inability to fairly distribute that wealth meant that workers were eating worse, living worse, and dying younger. Warfare had existed since the first Neolithic villages, but the scope of it was mostly limited to the theft of livestock and, women. Sorry for putting it that way, but it's true. Warfare fundamentally changed with the first cities. The technological boom and the specialized non-agricultural workers produced an unprecedented amount of material wealth. Copper metalworking, complex clothing, specialized pottery. All of this was done with brand new technology, which made these new cities unimaginably rich.
Yeah, once again, this is specialization, right? If you have enough food, then not everybody needs to be a subsistence farmer. Then it means that some people can train to do other professions. Which means, these civilizations brought together in cities that have been consolidated can really accomplish great things. Great works of architecture, law codes, writing, literature, all these different things that often rely on people working together, or at the very least, someone at the top ordering people to work together, right? One thing you'll find in cities as well. And of course, it depends on where you look, but it means that you may be able to have control over a consolidated group of, workers or builders or whomever. But you do also, in some instances, see growing solidarity over time once everybody has been brought together. So, I mean, it's just as simple as when you bring a lot of people together, you can accomplish great things. And when you bring a lot of people together and they live, you've basically got yourself a city, right? Sort of a fundamental mode of living there.
But the wealth brought with it danger. Rival cities now had more to gain than just livestock and women. Immediately after the invention of cities, we see walls going up around the cities. The professionalization of warfare had begun. Speaking of warfare, the dizzying level of wealth meant that the old consensus-based governing structures from the old Neolithic villages had to go. The first cities were ruled by a new class of kings and priests. Under this new system, society fundamentally changed.
And I will say, that this reads generally true to me, but I am simply not familiar enough with the historical and archaeological primary sources to give any type of detailed history of the first cities, right? Now, first of all, I think that's a pretty broad history. That's one thing. This is reminding me a little bit of the work video he did, what was that, a year or two ago at this point, where it's a little broad for my taste, as a historian. I like to keep things a little more specific. Makes me uncomfortable when we talk in broad strokes. So there's that. But with this in particular, like I said, this reads generally accurate. Though once again, whenever you generalize, you'll miss the specifics, and there will be exceptions. But I really just do not know the material well enough to contest anything, or even if not contest, to know exactly the specifics here. But you do think about these early human cities as being places that had some pretty autocratic rulership structures and often relied on kings and priests, as are stated here. That is my understanding of it. If anyone is an archaeologist working on this, you can comment down below. If you agree or disagree, I'd be interested to hear.
Power and wealth were brutally and sometimes violently centralized under the kings and priests. Workers in the new cities were somehow less free than they had been in the old villages. After a while, that lack of freedom became central to propping up these urban economies. Limited forms of slavery.
Yeah, I mean, that's not, and we're going to get into the slavery, it's not incredibly surprising to me. Now, that's not to say that, agricultural life is incredibly free either. I suppose it sort of depends on how things are ordered, right? If you're living around, say, a local lord, if you're out on the farm, then your work life probably won't be that free either. If we're talking about a system where there's more sort of spread out small-holding farmers, then you'll probably be quite self-reliant, and you might have a high degree of autonomy as long as you can keep yourself alive. But yeah, you gather people together in a city, and like I said, that may build some solidarity over time, but it's also going to lead to, I think, a lot of hierarchy, a lot of inequality, and the people at the top, using their power in order to accomplish these great projects and wars that we've been talking about.
Central to propping up these urban economies. Limited forms of slavery had existed back in the old Neolithic villages, but with the cities, slavery became institutionalized. In Mesopotamia, we know that at least 5% of the population of cities were slaves, and as these cities became more and more wealthy, the number of slaves tended to increase. The important takeaway from this is that all of this new wealth did not really help workers. Cities unlocked an unlimited amount of material wealth, and because of an inability to distribute that wealth, people had no choice but to work harder and die younger.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, it reminds me of when we talk about GDP today, right? We're talking about essentially the wealth of a country, their production, even GDP per capita, right, which is basically by population essentially, which is supposed to tell you how wealthy your country is per individual, right? So ideally, GDP per capita should tell you more how the average person is doing, but it doesn't really, right? Because if you have your wealth concentrated at the top, and you have an incredible amount of wealth in your country, both your GDP and your GDP per capita will look pretty good, even if the median person is doing really quite badly, right? So this is often why these type of statistics don't communicate the struggles of everyday people, right? So you can have an incredible wealth, but if it's distributed only to the top rungs of society, then your average person, they might not make any more money, they might not live longer, they might not actually do any better.
What a tragedy.
Europe.
And yet, despite these initial setbacks, the city continued to evolve as it moved into Europe through Greece. The agricultural land in Bronze Age Greece was relatively poor compared to Mesopotamia, which reduced the amount of material wealth floating around these new cities. Over time, this reduced the power of the kings and the ruling class of priests, making these new cities a lot less hierarchical than their Mesopotamian cousins. Tough geography meant that these new cities had to grow up in a dangerous neighborhood. As a response, they developed robust political systems that were able to mobilize the entire city when under threat.
Yeah, so it's clear to me at this point that this video is sort of a general history of the city. We're going pretty fast, so I wonder if we'll get to the modern city at some point. I don't want to repeat myself the whole video, but I will just reiterate that I think when you make sweeping historical narratives like this, you're going to end up fundamentally getting some things wrong, right? And I think if you asked historians of each of these different topics that he's going to talk about, they would point out a bunch of exceptions and a bunch of areas where this doesn't apply. I'm pretty skeptical of these type of, broad historical narratives generally. Not to say there can't be value in them. Of course there can. So just keep that in mind throughout this video. He's speaking very generally. I'm not, like I said, I'm not an expert on the topic, so I can't, whip out the literature to go through it. But it's just worth keeping that in mind when we're doing this type of very broad video. Now, once again, doesn't mean there's nothing to be learned and nothing of value being said. Absolutely, I'm sure there'll be some interesting stuff. But just, in terms of historical veracity, keep in mind that this is very general.
The old Mesopotamian cities evolved to be top-down and fragile, while these new Greek cities evolved to be bottom-up and resilient. By the 5th century BCE, Greece's complex political institutions meant that they could field armies 2 to 3 times larger than similarly sized Mesopotamian cities. As Greek cities began to mature, so too did their thinking about what cities ought to be.
We'll see if he gets to it, but I might challenge the idea that a lot of these cities were really that bottom up. I mean, a lot of them were still incredibly top down. I know we like to talk about Athenian democracy and everything, but the idea is frankly a little overblown in the first place, and they were quite, authoritarian systems in some of these cities. And even the supposedly democratic cities could sometimes be a bit, they could have a bit of an oligopoly going. So, but we'll see what he has to say about it.
Greece still had many villages that were modeled on the old Neolithic villages from back in the day. These villages were still governed by councils of elders that ruled by consensus. The Greeks struggled to understand what separated these old consensus-based villages from the new, dynamic cities with their complex political institutions. They knew that they were different, but they wanted to understand why they were different. They said,
I will say, it does seem to me, when you look at, these type of, ancient Neolithic villages, or when you look at more nomadic societies that may function somewhat similarly or even differently, a consensus-based decision-making structure does seem pretty common. There are a lot of examples of that around the world, throughout history, from the ancient world to the modern world, of those types of societies using a sort of political decision-making structure that is more consensus-based in nature. You can think of, and once again, now this is me generalizing, but I often think of the Mongol decision-making structure was more consensus-based. A lot of indigenous tribes had a more consensus-based structure. Now, that is a generalization. You can find examples that don't fit that. Think of Cahokia, right? If you're unfamiliar, that was an indigenous city, sort of around the Midwest of the modern United States. And that was very hierarchical and authoritarian, right? So definitely not consensus-based. But I do think you can find a lot of these consensus-based models.
That if an urban center was too small, like the old villages, then they would lose their autonomy and fall into the political orbit of a larger city. If they were too large, then they would lose their unique character and their shared political purpose and fracture. Where does one draw the line? Aristotle says that the ideal city should be large enough to be self-sufficient, but small enough for a person to easily see the whole city at once. Large enough to be politically independent, but small enough to walk across.
I mean, the idea of the city, we've been talking about why the city is important generally, but even the idea of the city has been pretty important, at least in sort of Western thinking and philosophy, since the ancient world. Just to clarify, once again, I always like to point out where I'm not an expert, which is most things, right? I'm not incredibly well read on my classical philosophy, right? But I do know that the city featured in the works of Plato and Aristotle. Of course, these are people who wrote about society and how to live in different modes of government even. And so it's unsurprising to me that the city played a role in that. The city was, I think, pretty important to the way a lot of these people thought about society and how best to live and run society.
Aristotle didn't know it at the time, but he had just stumbled upon a universal human constant.
Marchetti's constant. Okay. Let's hear about it.
In the late 1970s, an engineer working for the US Department of Transportation named Yakov Sahavi made a remarkable discovery.
We have jumped forward in time.
He discovered that across cultures, people will happily commute for about 1 hour per day, 30 minutes each way. This may not seem that exciting at first, but his breakthrough discovery was that this remains true, regardless as to the mode of travel. Walking, biking, horseback, rail, car, dirigible, spaceship, Zahavi found that people will happily make the trip, so long as the travel time is no more than 30 minutes each way. This was a significant breakthrough in the field of urban planning. It meant that one could mathematically predict the natural size of a city by simply figuring out how far one could travel in 30 minutes.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I've heard this before. Now, obviously, I don't know how sort of scientifically applicable that is, and whenever we say something is universal, I get immediately suspicious. However, it rings true just based on personal experience, right? I feel like people are generally okay commuting. After a certain point, it becomes tedious, and I think it makes sense it's across different forms of transportation, because it's more about the time being spent or the time being wasted on your commute rather than the distance you're going, right? I mean, if we could teleport and I could commute thousands of miles instantaneously, then I wouldn't care, right? Then it'd be fine. It's about taking the time to drive or to walk or to take a horse or however you're getting there. After a certain amount of time, you're doing, an hour commute back and forth or 2 hours overall of commuting each day. I know plenty of people who do that. It's not super fun. It's nicer to keep it on the shorter side, typically.
15 years later, an Italian physicist named Cesare Marchetti popularized Zahari's discovery in his paper Anthropological Invariance in Travel Behavior, nerd alert, and henceforth this principle became known as Marchetti's constant. Isn't that annoying?
Well,
in the years since its discovery, Marchetti's constant has been tested and found to be true not only across every region of the world, but across all of history. Remember what Aristotle said? A city should be small enough for a person to easily see the whole city at once. How far away is the horizon? About 5 kilometers. So according to Aristotle, a city should be no larger than 5 kilometers from end to end. Or, to think about it another way, a radius of no more than 2.5 kilometers from the center of the city to the edge. How long does it take to walk 2.5 kilometers? 30 minutes. That's Marchetti's constant.
The math seems a bit of a stretch, to be honest to me, but it seems somewhat intuitive, especially, in the ancient world, if you're walking, that you would want everything to be walkable within walking distance. Right? I feel like we can put it more simply that way. I think you could more easily, and you could back this up a little better than the math being done here. I think if you look at most of these cities, prior to the modern age or prior to rail, then you're basically going to need to be able to walk to be able to get to anything necessary, work, food, things like that. Of course, you could perhaps take a horse for a longer distance or whatever sort of animal you might have, but people throughout history have generally been walking to get where they need to go in their daily sedentary lives. Of course, that's been shaken up a little bit within modern history with the railroads and then automobiles and things like that. Though, of course, there's still a great discussion today about making cities more or less walkable, depending on where you are, essentially.
Aristotle was saying that when people can no longer make most of their trips in 30 minutes or less, cities begin to lose their unique character and their shared political purpose. He knew it 2,300 years before Zahavi or Marchetti. I mentioned this briefly years ago in the video Work, but it's worth repeating here that human brains love 30-minute increments. Across the world, we find that Neolithic humans measured time by tracking how long it took to make a certain tool, or how long it took to cook a certain meal, or how long it took to grind a certain amount of grain, or how long it took to burn a certain amount of wood, or how long it took to walk a certain distance. All around the world, people considered these things one unit of time, and they all worked out to approximately 30 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, look, once again, I'm always skeptical of universal claims. However, I do gotta recognize we're all human beings. We all have that in common. We've all got our biological clock running. And so, it makes sense to me that there's a certain chunk of time that, just, I guess, perhaps biologically, as humans, we're sort of predisposed to seeing time in these particular chunks. Now, depending on the society, that chunk might be associated with something different, but, that seems plausible to me.
We find that the same 30-minute benchmark was important, even in the semi-permanent seasonal settlements that predated the first Neolithic villages. Even here, we have archaeological evidence that people built their sleeping areas no more than 30 minutes away from where they made their stone tools, which was no more than 30 minutes away from where they stored their food, which was no more than 30 minutes away from their religious shrine. Marchetti's constant, even among hunter-gatherers. Marchetti's constant obviously applied to the first Neolithic villages, but it remained true for the first cities. Uruk, considered by many to be the world's first major city, had a walking radius of almost exactly 30 minutes from the center of the city to the walls. The royal city of Ur had a walking radius of no more than 15 or 20 minutes. The city of Babylon had a walking radius of about 12 minutes. The city of Nineveh was similar, about 12 minutes. The city of Memphis was even smaller. It had a walking radius of only 8 minutes.
See, isn't it nice to get into historical specifics? I prefer it when we're talking about specific events and places.
Fast forward to the Iron Age. At the peak of its power, the Greek city of Athens was a sprawling metropolis and one of the mightiest cities in the world. But even mighty Athens had a walking radius of no more than 18 minutes. If you're watching this video, you probably have at least a passing familiarity with the ancient city of Rome, so I trust I can go into a little more detail here. The Pomerium, which as we all know, was the semi-mystical line that showed where the walls of the old city used to be, were at most a 22-minute walk from the center of the city. What made Rome unique was that the extreme amount of wealth and treasure and slaves flowing into the city allowed for it to grow beyond the Pomerium.
Yeah, the thing about the Pomerium is that Rome outgrew the Pomerium by a lot, right? There was plenty of structures and buildings and civilization outside of the Pomerium.
Into a megacity of more than 1 million inhabitants. This made Rome way too big. Marchetti's constant sets a maximum walking radius of no more than 30 minutes, but the walking radius of ancient Rome was more like 90 minutes. As a consequence, people rarely left their own neighborhoods, and these areas became self-sufficient and took on unique characters of their own.
Yeah, I mean, even if we move away from Marchetti's constant and just think about this in a more simple way, you have these human settlements, these cities throughout history. Having 1 million people in a city, already makes you one of the biggest cities throughout history. Now, I know today we've got cities of millions and tens of millions of people. When you look before the modern era, to have a city of 1 million was quite the incredible accomplishment, especially in the ancient world. And as I was talking about, and as he's sort of referencing, people are mostly walking to go and do their daily tasks. And so essentially, you're going to want everything you need within a reasonable walking distance, which means either being in a smaller city, which was most cities at the time, or having everything you needed essentially within your neighborhood if you were in a much bigger city, right? So that makes sense. And I mean, even a lot of bigger cities today function that way, right? There's the idea that, even within your city, you should be able to walk and, go to a grocery store, get some food in your neighborhood, that sort of thing. When we don't have access to that, it seemed to be a problem, right? We have food deserts in some American urban areas, right? That seemed to be an issue. The problem there is you don't have a grocery store or fresh food within a certain distance, right? So this makes a lot of sense to me.
Because of its extreme wealth, Rome always struggled to function as a cohesive city. On paper, it violated Marchetti's constant, but in practice, it was really one central city within the Pomerium, with several self-contained suburban cities glommed onto it. It made no sense, and the people at the time knew it made no sense. Over the centuries, many elaborate schemes were drawn up to move thousands of people out of Rome and shrink the city down to a more manageable size. But none of these schemes were ever successful.
Yeah, well, the issue, it always comes back to land, right? Land, at least if we're talking in a European context, because land hasn't been as important in other sort of areas or civilizations throughout history. But land has really been our most important resource, and the issue with Rome is that as land out in the countryside was more consolidated in the hands of these wealthy landowners, well, all those farmers, or I should say former farmers, moved into the cities to go and find work. And so you have more and more and more people flowing into a couple of cities, but Rome especially, and the cities balloons in size, as the countryside is more and more dominated by wealthy slave-owning landowners.
What about the big medieval cities? Around the year 1400, the largest city in Europe was either Paris or Constantinople. In Paris, it was possible to walk from the center of the city to the edge of the city in just 22 minutes. In the case of Constantinople, geography made the city oddly shaped and huge, but even here, the urban walking radius never exceeded 30 minutes. Around the year 1450, the largest city in the world was Beijing, with a population 3 to 4 times larger than Paris or Constantinople. Was Beijing's walking radius also 3 to 4 times larger than Paris or Constantinople? No. Despite its size, Beijing's walking radius never exceeded 30 minutes.
I'm glad we brought Beijing into this, because I was going to say, you're talking about a supposedly universal human principle, we've only talked about the Middle East and Europe so far. So let's bring some other places into the equation.
Marchetti's constant was a remarkable natural limit on cities that emerged spontaneously all over the world. It's remained constant across all of human history, across all types of geography, across all levels of wealth, and across all different cultures.
That may or may not be true. I think parts of it seem believable to me. I just, I don't like all statements. For those who don't know, I went to school for history. I went and did a master's degree in history. I feel like anyone who's studied history at the undergraduate or the graduate level, you got to know that these all-encompassing statements, they're dangerous for historians. When you say all human civilizations did this, or this was the most, or the earliest, those things are very, very hard to prove in history. You know, Now, I'm not saying historians don't make those statements. They do. And they're usually wrong about them. They usually make them to sell their new book or to make an argument. And, that's fine enough. I can understand doing it for the sake of the argument. But, I just like to be cautious about these types of things. And maybe I'm particularly cautious about those kinds of statements, given I'm just rattling stuff off from the top of my head. But I'm just saying, these types of all statements, all encompassing points and arguments, I'd maybe shy away from those a little bit.
Is until something catastrophic happened to cities in the 1600s.
Capitalism. Historia Civilis' greatest enemy.
Capitalism. Beginning in the 17th century, there was an explosive increase in overseas trade, which caused a severe concentration of wealth in the port cities across Europe. The old medieval cities had spent centuries evolving into a useful form, with a walking radius of no more than 30 minutes. But the massive influx of wealth triggered a sudden building boom in the port cities. And
this is true. I mean, you can look at a couple different places. When you look at, for example, France during this period, so like 17th, 18th centuries, as them and England began to build their colonial empires, right? Portugal and Spain already had their colonial empires. You can look at the economies of the sort of inland cities of France and compare them to the Atlantic cities. And the Atlantic cities had a lot more going on, had a lot more trade flowing through, had a lot more economic activity. Now, of course, Paris is an exception, right? Paris was the center of it all. But if we compare other cities outside of Paris, you'll see there was incredible economic activity on France's Atlantic coast that actually diminished to a certain extent when France basically lost her empire to Britain in the 7 Years' War. So you can sort of see that cause and effect there. Though, of course, France would continue to build that empire over time. So yes, the age of exploration, colonization, plantation slavery, trade, all of these things brought an incredible amount of wealth to European shores, and literally, oftentimes, to shores to these cities along the coast, and then a couple of, evolving capital cities like Paris, London, etc.
And a sudden disinvestment in the old inland medieval cities. This change was incredibly disruptive to daily life. The old medieval cities had evolved slowly across topographical lines, meaning that they were uniquely shaped depending on the hilliness of the area, or the access to fresh water, or the quality of the soil. In other words, they obeyed the laws of nature. The booming port cities were suddenly so rich that they could afford to ignore the laws of nature. In order to accommodate all of this new wealth, they began blindly building out into the undeveloped land surrounding the cities. But they didn't build in the way that cities had been built in the past. The old medieval cities had been carefully built up over centuries until they reached a sustainable size. Beginning in the 17th century, the booming port cities were no longer built in that way. Wealthy capitalists bought up huge stretches of empty land and developed it all at once. They built straight over the hills and the rivers and the rocky soil that had once served as natural barriers for the old medieval cities.
Yeah, I mean, in the modern age, we have entirely planned cities. Not all of them, but some of them. And there was a lot of pre-planning that went into these. You see, I mean, it's funny. A lot of our more like modern cities, especially in the United States, use a grid plan, which was sort of copied off of the Roman cities of old, right? Um, but the medieval cities oftentimes have not really followed that. You got all these winding, curving streets, but a lot of these cities in the American colonies and then in the United States often adhered to these grids. I mean, even some of the East Coast earlier settled cities like New York and Philly, but especially a lot of the cities as you go further west. So it is interesting to look at that change in structure and design over time. Though that's part of what he's mentioning here, but not all of it. He's talking about something a little different.
What had once been done
I
carefully.
mean, he's basically talking about the difference between a city building over time. So you're building on slowly, you're adding a home, a neighborhood, versus it all being done at once. And then there may be a lot of, unforeseen issues when people actually start living there.
Over centuries, was now built recklessly over decades. This explosion of wealth allowed for behavior that was completely anti-historical, in the sense that people began to ignore the natural physical constraints that were placed upon cities. They also began to ignore the psychological constraints on the human brain. For the first time, basically ever, the capitalist builders began to systematically violate Marchetti's constant. This
Not really constant then, is it? No, I understand the point.
reckless expansion meant
I would say if you set me up with any constant or uniform rule, humans will violate it at one point or another.
that in an ever-growing number of cities, it became impossible to walk from the center of the city to the edge of the city in 30 minutes or less. Think carefully about what happened here. The influx of cheap money into the port cities induced a kind of mania. Natural laws of the city, like Marchetti's constant, were disregarded in order to build as quickly as possible.
There's no such thing as natural laws, I'm sorry to say. It's just like a fiction made up by Enlightenment era writers. I don't not to come out so strongly, but this is why I don't like the idea of these uniform rules or natural laws. No such thing. We can observe human behavior over time, and you can generalize and say, well, people tend to do this, but this is why I don't like the idea of natural laws. And also, and it's difficult to argue the point because we're speaking so generally. I mean, yes, this growth of cities, I mean, it had to do with a lot of things. It had to do with that money pouring in from what we've talked about already, right? The age of exploration and colonization, and the wealth that came from that, and the plantation slavery done in the Americas. All of that was bringing money in, which was developing these cities. But of course, a massive boom also comes with industrialization, right? That brings a lot of this. And also, I would argue, and at this point, we're far earlier, but I'd be interested to look at the particular cities he's talking about. And I'd wonder, when they really became less walkable. Was it at this time or was it a little bit later when you had like trains and streetcars and things like that? Because that definitely made it so that people, could go longer distances than if they were just walking each day. So, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say because we are speaking pretty generally here.
Real human preferences were ignored in order to accommodate this fake thing called capital. Lewis Mumford, a 20th century historian specializing in the history of the modern city, summed it all up in one sentence. The nature and the purpose of the city had been completely forgotten.
Sprawl. Now, we have a lot of that today.
Urban growth, or sprawl, is really a creature of capitalism, and as it accelerated through the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, a really perverse thing began to happen. Land speculation grew into an industry unto itself, and in some cases became even more profitable than the overseas trade that kicked this whole thing off. The buying and selling of land on a speculative basis was really just gambling. It added nothing to society, but whoever happened to be holding the right land at the right time hit the jackpot.
Yeah, though, I'm not sure this had so much to do with cities per se, but it is true that during the period he's talking about, If we're talking the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, think that time period, age of exploration, there was a massive rise in land speculation, in large part because the Europeans were exploring a lot of territory which they had not explored beforehand. Obviously, there were already indigenous people living in these places. If we're talking about the Americas, or, of course, the Europeans were really going around the world at this point. But yeah, I mean, we recently did videos on, essentially the westward expansion of the U.S. following the Revolution before the War of 1812. And a big part of that is that a bunch of wealthy Americans had basically bought up the rights to land out west. They were speculating on land out west that they hadn't ever seen, most of them, and that sort of encouraged them to advocate for, let's push further westwards and let's fight against these Native Americans because we want to make some money on this land speculation. So yes, land speculation became very popular. It was essentially gambling with your money, making this very risky investment, and it often drove a lot of destructive and unproductive behavior.
All of this speculative churn drove up the price of land all across Europe. To be clear, these speculators often weren't even building anything. They were just buying and selling and buying and selling and driving the price of land up and up and up.
Yeah, so I guess he's referring more to land speculation back in Europe, whereas I was thinking more land speculation in the sort of the conquered territories. So I get maybe a slightly different phenomenon.
By the 19th century, empty land was 50 to 100 times more expensive than it had been right before the mania began. Land speculators were becoming unimaginably rich with...
I mean, there's just a lot of stuff we're not talking about, right? If you think about, say, Britain during this time period, we're skipping from like, the 1400s to the 1600s, forward to the industrial age. But if we're speaking so generally, if you think of, say England during this time period, you also have essentially the consolidation of agricultural land, as we saw back in ancient Rome, into the hands of a few wealthy landowners. You have the enclosure of land, right? So land that once might have been deemed public land, even if it was technically owned by the local lord, was enclosed, and a lot of this land would become more valuable, and the agricultural produce would increase and become more valuable. So you did have this situation where land was becoming more expensive over time, more closed off to a lot of people in the countryside. Farmers were losing their land, people were losing their jobs out in the countryside. So once again, what happened? People flooded into cities, right? In this case, particularly London, but cities all throughout the British Isles. So that's another part of this. But yeah, there's a lot that's being said here and a lot that's not being covered over a really long span of time.
Without even building anything. A new term was invented for this new class of capitalists who got rich over dubious schemes like land speculation.
Oh?
They called them millionaires. Huh. It was not meant as a compliment. This speculative mania of the 19th century led to some unexpected consequences. Back in old medieval Europe, housing took up about 10% of a working person's income. Costs were fixed and consistently low. The thing that made medieval workers lose sleep at night was the price of food, which consumed about 50% of a worker's income. That's why there were riots whenever the price of food spiked.
Yeah, I mean, you can see throughout medieval Europe, I can't attest to these numbers in particular. I'm not sure quite where he's getting these statistics from, if this is all of medieval Europe or one place in particular. But it is true that, of course, compare industrial Europe, 19th century Europe, to medieval Europe, there was a lot more frequent famine throughout medieval Europe. Now, it doesn't mean there was no famine in the 19th century. There was. You can look at Ireland. You can look at the 1840s, which were a decade sort of generally of famine. But the presence of famine definitely decreased as we head into the modern era, as food became more widely available.
19th century, the unambiguously good news for everybody was that industrialization was beginning to drive down the price of food.
Well, a couple of things. I mean, industrialization, the introduction of taters, right? Potatoes, which were found in the Americas, right? A lot of crops that we use today are native to the Americas, like tomatoes and potatoes, right? So you get pizza, well, modern pizza, right? You had pizza. But potatoes, that's one. Potatoes were, very easy to grow in pretty bad environmental conditions. And so as potatoes were brought from the Americas over to Europe, that they really became the staple crop of, thousands, millions of people across Europe. And that really led to population growth and also made food more widely available. So it's a couple of things. I mean, not just industrialization, the introduction of new crops, new sort of agricultural technologies. But yes, food became a lot more widely available.
This was probably one of the greatest things that ever happened. Each marginal decrease in the price of food instantly raised the standard of living of poor people. It's hard to think of any other innovation that's helped so many people so quickly. However, while the price of food was beginning to be driven down, rampant land speculation was driving up the price of housing exponentially. It would seem that this would all be heading for a crash. There is, after all, a physical limit on how much a city can sprawl. But in the 1860s, our old friend, the Industrial Revolution, intervened, and that physical limit fell away.
Trains.
By this time, passenger rail for the purpose of commuting to work was beginning to go mainstream. If land speculators could influence where the new rail lines were built, they could hit the jackpot just for owning random bits of land in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. When you look at the expansion of these railways, right, land that at one point had been worthless, if you've got a railroad going through it, all of a sudden it becomes prime real estate, right? So there was quite a rush for buying up land and building railroads. I mean, during the late 19th century, there were a bunch of different railroad companies, most of which eventually failed. This was true in a lot of places, the UK, the United States, because there was a lot of money to be made. So there were a lot of railroads being built, and the land was really an important part of this.
This kicked off a second golden age of land speculation. And since it all depended upon where the rail lines were built, it created limitless opportunities for corruption.
Oh, yeah.
The thing about Marchetti's constant is that it remains true irrespective of the form of transportation. Human brains will naturally favor a 30-minute walking radius, but they will also favor a 30-minute radius when traveling by rail. As speed increases, so does distance. This meant that with the railways, cities began to sprawl in every direction at once, as fast as people could build. Industrial sprawl in the 19th century created an unconstrained capitalist feeding frenzy. We've never seen anything like it, before or since. And what made the feeding frenzy particularly egregious was that throughout it, very little was done to actually improve the material conditions within existing cities.
I mean, we are talking about a period of time that in the United States we call the Gilded Age, right? The late 19th century, truly the sort of height of unfettered industrial capitalism. You had incredible growth, incredible profit, incredible production, and of course all the downsides that came with that, unfettered industrial capitalism. These terrible working conditions, the terrible housing conditions, the slums in cities around the world, all these different things, people working for 16-hour shifts, your arm gets torn off in a machine, well, too bad, all that type of stuff.
Throughout this period, the city was reduced to nothing more than a money-making instrument of the capitalist class. Lewis Mumford vividly described the decline of the city in the 19th century. In the interest of expansion, capitalism was prepared to destroy the most satisfactory social equilibrium. No matter how venerable these old uses might be, they would be sacrificed to financial gain.
Declining standard of living. I like the gradient, the coloring.
In the 19th century, working class people really got to experience the wonders of the Industrial Revolution firsthand. Welcome to hell. The old medieval cities were never great, and they were rarely even good, but at least they worked. In the 19th century,
Wow, that's quite the indictment. They were rarely great, often not even good. Okay.
because of all this new capitalist churn, European cities stopped working. Medieval cities were extremely expensive to build, but they always stopped growing once they hit a walking radius of 30 minutes. This meant that once medieval cities were built, they could be maintained relatively cheaply for centuries. The Industrial Revolution flipped that equation on its head. The rampant land speculation of the 19th century incentivized cities to sprawl in all directions at once, using the cheapest building materials possible. Nowadays, we have a term for these types of neighborhoods: slums. The new industrial slums were awful places to live, but they were extremely profitable to the land speculators and the industrialists that built them. The cost of maintaining the old medieval cores of cities was trivial, but in the end it was less profitable than building brand new slums on empty land. And so over time, capital investment flowed away from the old medieval cores and into the more profitable industrial slums.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's more to this than just talking about cities, frankly. But if you're a industrial working class individual, a member of the proletariat in the 19th century, things are pretty bad for you. Right? There's a reason that this was the time period during which socialism and communism arose, because people, like, in particular, two fellas named Marx and Engels, took a look at the life of the industrial working class, mainly in England, in places like Manchester, and said, holy shit, this is horrible. These are just about the worst living and working conditions you could imagine, right? Like I was referencing earlier, you wake up in your horrific, tiny little slum, you're squished in like sardines with a bunch of other people. You then go to work your 16-hour shift, terrible conditions, very few, breaks or anything like that. Very little protection. Once again, your arm gets ripped off in the machine. Well, too bad for you. You make your little bit of money for the day. You go home. Maybe you go out and buy a pint with it, and the newspaper writes about how terrible it is that working people are drinking. You go back to your shitty apartment, and then that's your day. You continue it the next day, right? So definitely a truly terrible standard of living. The wealth of these cities and these countries, like the UK and the US and France and all these places, their wealth was ballooning. They were becoming fantastically wealthy due to industrialization and continued empire and colonization. But a lot of the people of these cities, these countries, were not feeling that wealth. Now, some of them were. Your emerging sort of middle class, and of course your upper class, right? The owners of all of this. But, the vast numbers of people, the working class, were having a pretty bad time. And of course that leads to solidarity and organizing and unions and all that business really kicking off in the mid to late 19th century and continuing past that point. So people could really, fight to have a decent standard of living.
The ultimate irony is that these new industrial slums were so poorly built that they had to be torn down and rebuilt after only 20 years. The old medieval cities were expensive to build, but they lasted centuries. The new industrial slums were cheap to build, but they only lasted decades. Over the course of the 19th century, European cities became objectively worse. The material living conditions of workers did not improve at all, and yet industrialists and capitalists became extremely rich. The exponential growth of industrial slums reduced cities to nothing more than a money-making instrument of the capitalist class.
I mean, I'd say cities were still a bit more than that, but I understand the point he's making. Might be a little reductive.
And everybody else paid the price for it. Up to this point in history, most cities were built alongside rivers.
True.
The reasons for this should be obvious. Free drinking water, free sewer system, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. Obviously, one of these should happen downstream of the other, but it's...
Yeah, hopefully whoever was in charge of those things understood that. Sometimes they did not.
Took humanity an embarrassingly long time to figure that out.
Yep.
One of the problems with the...
I mean, no one knew the reason why that was bad for a long time. But throughout history, there have been people, though they didn't know the science behind it, who said, you know what? Maybe we should be shitting downstream from where we're drinking. Maybe we don't want our sewage flowing through our drinking water. Let's use the bathroom a little further down the river, even if they didn't know the science. There have been some people who were saying that throughout history, and plenty of other people who didn't care. That thought didn't enter their head.
These new industrial slums was that they were being thrown up so quickly that they ignored the natural geography of existing cities. The new slums either lacked access to fresh water, which also meant that they lacked access to a natural sewer system, or they were built on land that was prone to flooding, which meant that at certain times of the year, they became the sewer system.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the sewer systems, a lot of this you can think, we've been talking about these cities. Think of London in the mid-19th century. They dealt with a phenomenon called the Great Stink. I'm not kidding. Look it up. That's where the city became so congested and so clogged with people, and they did not have a modern sewer system, and it got pretty nasty. The River Thames in particular. It was about as bad as you could imagine. It was named the Great Stink for a reason, right? So that was one of the consequences of all these people flowing into this rapidly industrializing city.
Welcome to City.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Lewis Mumford described the disgusting conditions of 19th century slums. Never before in recorded history had such vast masses of people lived in such savagely deteriorated environment, ugly in form, debased in content.
Yeah, I mean, I reckon people will hear that and be like, well, there have been bad living conditions throughout history. Read the quote a little more closely. Had such vast masses of people. So that's true. Of course, there have been horrible living conditions throughout history. But it is true that, during the 19th century, just the vast quantity of people who were crammed into these terrible conditions. It was truly unprecedented. Now, that trend has continued till today in certain places around the world. You can still find these terrible, terrible slums.
Cholera and typhoid fever became alarmingly common in a way that it never had been before. A single outbreak in a city could easily wipe out 10,000 people. Even the air became poisonous. The new industrial slums and their adjacent factories spent all day burning coal and belching poisonous black soot into the air.
Yeah, it's funny, in the Middle Ages, they had the idea of the miasma, right? The miasma, where they were trying to work out how illness worked. Well, maybe it's something sort of floating through the air. And that was an idea that actually persisted up really into the modern era. But at this time, during the Industrial Revolution, the air really did become poison from all the coal pollution and soot in the air. That was actually was bad for people to breathe in.
Soot got all over people's clothes, into the soil, into the water, into people's homes, and even into their lungs.
Yeah. I mean, the lungs is the worst part of that, and the water, that's what really makes you sick. But the rest of it was pretty annoying too. I did my undergrad out in Pittsburgh, and of course that was a big steel city back in the day. And it was well known that if you left for work in the morning with your nice white shirt, by the time you came back, it would be gray with soot, right? Back, I don't know, prior to the 70s, prior to the... Yeah, I mean, that's basically when steel production started falling off a cliff. When all that beautiful soot was in the air in the 60s and 50s and 40s, and prior to that, obviously. So you probably want to bring a change of shirt with you if you wanted to keep your shirt looking nice.
We know that prolonged exposure to soot causes permanent brain damage, and everybody in the industrial slums was exposed. Researching this video, I was surprised to learn that breathing soot damages one's taste buds, which may explain why English cuisine evolved to be, let's say, heavy on texture and light on flavor.
That's funny.
Nobody could taste anything. In short, the industrial slums created a hell on earth. The long-term health effects of this prolonged exposure to poisonous air and contaminated water was catastrophic. And to examine these effects, it might be best to look at 19th century New York City.
Oh, okay.
In 1810, New York City was booming and just beginning the process of industrialization. And since it was the 19th century, we know that infant mortality was extremely high. 12% of children died before their first birthday. Over the next 40 years, industrialization came to New York. And with industrialization came the vast industrial slums that ignored the natural geography of the city. By the year 1850, pollution and poor sanitation had poisoned the air and contaminated the water, which moved infant mortality from extremely high to extremely, extremely high.
Sheesh.
By 1850, 18% of children died before their first birthday.
Yeah, I mean, that incredibly tragic statistic. Not incredibly surprising. Some people might be shocked to hear that it went up the later you got, right? But you think about it, the people we're talking about are not, I mean, I don't know. I'm sure there were some medical advances in that time. I'm not that familiar with them, to be honest. If there were, the people we're talking about would simply not have had access to any of those medical advances, and they were living in these incredibly dirty and dangerous and disease-ridden slums, right? So it's not surprising it got worse over time as New York grew and industrialized. It probably, well, my guess is it would have gotten even worse later into the century before peaking at a certain point. I don't know when.
By the mid-century, industrialization had kicked into overdrive, which meant that the problem was significantly worse only 10 years later. By 1860, 22% of children died before their first birthday. 10 years after that, it was even worse. In 1870, 24% of children died before their first birthday. In only 60 years, New York City had increased its population by 10 times.
I wonder at what year it peaked, because in the late 19th century, everyone recognizes how terrible these conditions are, right? You don't need to be a Marx or Engels to look at this and see, oh my God, this is horrible. And so that's when you get the development of what is called the progressive movement in the United States, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, and also a whole bunch of what you might call moral reformers of the era, some of which were focused on alcohol, right? You got the prohibition movement. You got all these kinds of different social movements. A big part of this were people who wanted to improve the conditions of the poor. That was often served with a healthy serving of, well, you need to behave yourself better as well. The two sort of often went in tandem, but there was definitely an effort to improve these terrible conditions at the time, heading into the late 19th century.
Had industrialized its economy, and in doing so had become one of the richest cities on Earth. And yet, over the same time period, the living conditions of working people was declining, and because of this, infant mortality doubled. New York became rich, but it had to step over the bodies of tens of thousands of children to get there.
Sheesh, it's a morbid way to put it. But yeah, once again, I mentioned this much earlier in the video, but you got to think about the difference between something like GDP or the wealth of a city or a country and the conditions of the actual people who live there, right? You always want to investigate these statistics that you're being fed to see if they actually make any sense, right? For example, there's a lot of talk about inflation, right? Inflation's a big issue for people. And sometimes people will try to downplay that. Well, look at this number and look at that number. And if you investigate a little bit, what you'll see is that, over time, over the years, yeah, inflation's been low for things like TVs. TVs are still pretty cheap, but things like college costs, medical care, those things have massively gone up in price. Just the sort of essentials of people's lives. I'm speaking about the United States here because that's what I'm familiar with, right? So when people say, man, it's really hard to get by, and you say, well, TVs are pretty cheap. It's like, well, that's nice, but I don't need to buy a TV at the grocery store every week, right? So you always want to take a look at what people are actually going through in their day-to-day lives.
Earlier, I called industrialization driving down the price of food one of the greatest things that ever happened. According to some studies, cheap and available food increased life expectancy by 4 to 5 years. But, according to these same studies, out-of-control pollution simultaneously reduced life expectancy by 4 to 5 years.
Oh.
The living conditions in the industrial slums were so bad that the immense health benefits of the agricultural revolution were completely wiped out.
Well, it's also, oftentimes when we look at life expectancy of the past, people think it would be like so low. And of course it is lower than it is now, but a massive contributor to that low life expectancy was high rates of infant mortality, right? And we saw how high the rates of infant mortality were in that graph he was showing us, right? And so, life expectancy will raise by a lot if you can get those infant mortality numbers down. If more infants start living past that age and then children can live into adulthood, then life expectancy is pretty good, actually.
Working people did not begin to see the benefits of industrialization until well into the 20th century. What am I saying here? I'm saying that cities are the greatest things ever invented by human beings.
I still like the wheel. I don't know. I don't know if I can name the one singular greatest thing ever invented by humans, but I think cities are pretty great, right? And we talked about in the introduction, or in the beginning of the video, the development of human civilization is definitely linked up with the creation and development of cities. And I do think cities are pretty incredible things, right? You're bringing a bunch of people together. I know some people like or dislike, right? Some people prefer the good old countryside, and I love me some nature, but I'm definitely a city appreciator.
By almost any metric, people today are unimaginably wealthy when compared to our ancestors. And the thing that has made us wealthy is the city. And yet, throughout history, there's this weird paradox. Whenever there's a societal change and a massive amount of new wealth flows into cities, this creates temporary distortions, which tend to cause the standard of living of working people to decline.
Yeah, I mean, history is full of disruptions, essentially. And the advent of, modern capitalism or industrial capitalism or whatever you want to call it was one of the greatest disruptions of human history, right? It really changed everything. There's a reason that this modern era, the last 200 or so years of history, have been so drastically different than everything else we've done throughout really the history of humankind. It's been a massive, massive disruption. And, disruptions at smaller levels have really happened throughout history, which impact the lives of everybody present.
When we moved from Neolithic villages to the first cities, the kings and the ruling class of priests became unfathomably rich. And yet, the people had no choice but to work harder and die younger. When cities found their natural size, land speculators reduced cities to nothing more than a money-making instrument of the capitalist class by inducing endless sprawl, enriching themselves in the process, and impoverishing everybody else in their wake. When industrialization showed the promise of eliminating food scarcity once and for all, which to our ancestors would have seemed like an unlimited amount of wealth, industrialists instead created endless seas of industrial slums, which led to a steadily declining standard of living.
Yeah, well, I'll always keep this in mind. How do I want to put this? Abundance isn't necessarily the solution unless you have distribution of that abundance, right? You can have an abundance of all the resources you might want, unless they're distributed to people in what you consider to be a fair manner, then the lives of average people are not really going to improve. I think we've had plenty of examples of that throughout history. So along with surpluses or an abundance or whatever you want to call it, you also need a distribution of that abundance.
They took infinite wealth and made working people live in their own filth. Obviously, people today are better off than people were 100, 1,000, or 10,000 years ago.
Oh
But the
yeah.
pattern over time is fairly consistent. A wave of capital rushes into cities. The ruling class gets drunk off of the new wealth, and they begin to behave erratically in a way that you could describe as antisocial or even anti-human. This behavior can be overcome. The influx of wealth can find its way to workers, but reform is difficult, and it often takes centuries.
Okay. I don't know if we were going to get a last line there. He's linking to work, unsurprisingly. So, here are my conclusions. This one reminds me a lot of work. It's clear it's in the same series. It's Historia Civilis, I guess now is sort of two different types of videos. There's the history videos, and then these sort of socio-political commentaries, or whatever you might call them. I know there's going to be a lot of people who really hate this one, all right? Now, I don't hate it, okay? I'll say that. Of course, I've got my critiques of it, just as I did with the work video. My conclusion on this is that, there's definitely some interesting points being made. Like I said during the video, I am never a fan, regardless of who's making them, of these sweeping historical generalizations and narratives. Just as someone who, has a graduate degree in history, those things make me very uncomfortable. I like to speak with historical specificity, and when you're making an argument that spans thousands of years and covers the entire world, I think that's a tough argument to make and a tough argument to buy. And then, it's clear at certain points in the video, we're hopping from Constantinople to Rome to Beijing, and then the latter half of the video where we're talking about, like England and New York City in the late 19th century, is just so broad. So that's just always very tough for me to buy. I do think it's interesting to talk about the development of the city and how that might correspond to different ways of ordering human society and different political systems. I always think, and I just think with something as broad as this, first of all, you leave a lot of things out. I mean, so much was left out that was related to the topic. And then also you sort of, you talk about a bunch of things in relation to cities that may be connected to something else. I was thinking during this video of the author C.L.R. James, who wrote a lot. In fact, is one of the premier authors on the Haitian Revolution. He wrote back in the early 20th century. And in his book Black Jacobins, which is a great read if you're interested in the topic, he sort of talks about how these Caribbean slave plantations were almost sort of proto form of the industrial factory. He talks about how people were brought together and the treatment and sort of a form of solidarity and things like that. And I always think that's a fascinating piece of writing, and it makes me think that we didn't even talk about factories in this video, right? Factories are important to a lot of the changes that were being discussed here. So yeah, I don't know. It's definitely interesting, but I always think you miss a lot when you do a long video like this, and to really engage with all the points being made. And maybe, I'm too much of a pedant and I take these types of things too seriously, right? We're dealing with a YouTube video, not a journal, a historical journal article. So maybe I should just relax about it. But I'm sort of like, to deal with all the points being made, you'd have to be an expert in so many different topics in anthropology and history and sociology. I don't know how anyone could even possibly engage with all of this. So, I did my best to give my opinions and my thoughts and to clarify where I'm not an expert, and I'm not an expert in anything that we talked about in this video. But definitely, look, it's interesting, it's thought-provoking, and I certainly had a lot to say. So, I hope you guys enjoyed this reaction. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Thank you all for watching. I hope you're all having a great day, and I'll see you all again next time. Goodbye.